Hello and welcome to week 3 of Education 107 Part 2. So, for this week, we're going to briefly talk about the methods of collecting quantitative and qualitative data. We are also going to talk a little bit more about considering your key questions, a mixed method approach, upcoming assignments, as well as the grocery store observation that is due this week. So, let's get started. So, when we talk about quantitative methods of collecting data, these are the ways that we can uncover objective truths. These can be uncovered through inquiry and through a neutral stance. So, this is something that helps remove the researcher from the actual research itself. And it also, because then the results are then based on the data, not perceptions. And then they provide a number to the results so that we can get percentages and averages as opposed to just simply perceptions that we can that typically is found in qualitative research. The aspects of the quantitative approach is that data is collected through measurement. Data is analyzed through numerical comparisons and statistical inferences. And data are reported through statistical analysis. So again, this is how we assign numbers to the outcomes of an evaluation, to the outcomes of a test. So this is how we can then put them in a numerical category is through quantitative approaches. So here's an example of a quantitative evaluation. So he wants to know about employees' attitudes before and after a training program. So he conducts a pre-test design, and he does conduct a survey before and after the intervention to get a pre-test and a post-test measure. So in the result of the survey, he found 75% of employees rate the training as highly effective. So he is able to argue that the training he conducted was highly effective. So, some of the limitations with a quantitative approach is that it does not consider the history of this training program, the context in which it was delivered, or the interpretation of the participants. Some of the advantages of a quantitative approach: they're typically faster, you can quickly do them more cost effective, and they seen more as objective. Now, let's talk a little bit about qualitative methods. So, in this sense, the truth can be more subjective and experiential. So, this is going to be based on people's perceptions and people's experiences throughout the evaluation or throughout the testing process. It is a little bit more difficult for the research to separate themselves from what is actually being studied or what is being tested. So, you would have to then speak to any potential biases or any positionality that you may have as the researcher. And it is, again, this is subjective and it can influence how we research, test, or evaluate a program. So, some of the aspects of qualitative research: data can be collected through participant observation and or interviews. Data is analyzed by key themes from the informants, from the participants. Data is reported in the language of the participant. So it's from their experience, it's from their perspective. So it's important to note that the outcomes of a qualitative evaluation can actually may need to be shifted in a way where the language is in generalized for everyone who could potentially read this study or this evaluation. Here's an example of a qualitative. So Tim wants to know how the training influenced the employees' attitudes. So drawing on purposive sample of employees, he interviews several workers in the organization. So a purposive sample is where you outline specifically who the participants are, their age group, their professional background. It could be their national origin. And then you fit your participants within that criteria, and then that becomes your propulsive sample. So you're outlining a criteria and then gaining participants who fit that criteria. That is a propulsive sample. Now, continuing with the evaluation, he looks for disconfirming cases and interviews them. In this report, he describes the employee's perspective. Employees describe the training as somewhat helpful. So that is the language that he uses in the report. Now, he is also very careful to define what that term means from the perspective of the participant. So if they're using a certain language that has been recurring throughout the process, you want to get the perspective of the employees of how they define that term or that word. So when you report the findings, you can then speak to that, and then everyone understands what that means in terms of the outcome of your study, the outcome of your evaluation. So more on qualitative approach. Some of the limitations, it's not generalizable. That means it cannot always be used in every context. The results cannot always be used in every environment because there may be different variables such as environment, such as background, such as age group that could then influence the outcomes of that study. So the bias of the researcher could potentially interfere with the validity of the outcome. So you have to be very careful in terms of how you are approaching your study, how you are approaching your evaluation to limit any potential biases. And this can be a very time consuming approach. So in terms of our project, our evaluation project, you may want to consider how, if you want to use people's perceptions, how you can do that in a very short time frame without having to revisit or have additional conversations due to the condensed time frame of the course. Some of the advantage of a qualitative approach, it does provide a descriptive and contextual idea of what people experience, what they feel, and their perceptions of the program, their perceptions of a test or their experiences. And it captures a more human-centered approach than quantitative data, because we're capturing how people feel, we're capturing their experiences, and quantitative data typically only captures a performance of a test, the performance of a program, as opposed to how people are experiencing or feeling towards a process, a program. Now, one way that we could actually use both in terms of measuring performance and then measuring the outcomes and the experiences of participants is a mixed method approach. I do highly suggest using this approach. This approach in your evaluation project could be simply creating a survey monkey survey that is sent out to your participants. All the tools are there for you to analyze your data in that format. And then you can conduct some quick informal interviews. And then you have a mixed methods approach. You have the quantitative outcomes from the Survey Monkey. And then you also have the perceptions gained from the informal interviews in a qualitative sense. So a mixed method is really just employing both approaches that can help decision makers get that hard data that they need, but they're also able to understand the experiences of the participants within the program, and then they can and potentially shift to create the best outcomes for the program, but also what their people and participants need. So, upcoming assignments. So, we have our grocery store evaluation. So, for example, this outcome was conducted at a organic grocery store in Beverly Hills. So they're kind of outlining what's happening here. So they give a background of the store. It specializes in locally grown produce, and it has an award-winning section of international foods. The employees tend to have a high school education. They live about an hour away, and they don't have a lot of experience at the store, and there's high turnover within the organization. So you have what the store is, and then you're given a little context in terms of turnover, employee engagement. It does have high prices. The store does very well, yet the employees are not paid very well, and they don't currently have a union. And now they're comparing it here to the other grocery store in the community where the employees make more and they're also part of a union. The store surveys indicate that customers are satisfied with the food offerings but rate overall satisfaction with the store experience as average. So, some of that influence could be the employees having to drive, they're not paid very well, they're just not very satisfied with their environment. Now, for our assignment, you may not have access to all of this data, and that's fine, but these are some of the things you may want to consider in terms of where you're going to evaluate. Are you familiar with this? Are you familiar with the store? Are you familiar with these products? As I noted earlier, I conducted a similar evaluation at a Target that I frequent. So I was very familiar with the store. I was very familiar with the environment. So it made the observation easier for me to digest. But it also made me more aware of things I didn't notice before. So consider where you're going to conduct your observation because this could be very helpful in terms of picking out some things you may not notice before. So let's evaluate. Now in this picture, there's several things that we could potentially evaluate. We could evaluate presentation. We could evaluate prices. We could evaluate cleanliness. We could evaluate service. Because even in this slide, let's think about it in terms of service. And we had a question, and no one was available to assist us. How would we rate the service in the store at that time? How would we then consider service in this store if we were unable to locate a store worker, an employee? So when you go into evaluate, consider these options that evaluation is more than just sometimes it's more than just what we see on a surface level. We have to consider other things. Is the store clean? Are the shelves well stocked? Is there someone available to assist us? So all of these things can go into an evaluation. So qualitative evaluations, it could be some of the questions we can ask is why do people buy organic produce? What are employees' experiences at the store? How do these compensation practices impact employee performance? And then why do customers rate their satisfaction at the store as average? Now, quantitative evaluation, what percentage of produce sold at the store is internationally grown? How many employees are likely to leave Fresh Eats before 1 year? To what extent does their compensation practices impact their performance? So now, if you notice, we're looking more at experiences in people. Quantitative, we're looking at some specific outcomes in terms of performance. Now, is our data being collected? Is it valid? Is it reliable? Right? So an internal validity is, does the data accurately represent what we're assuming is represented? So are the outcomes of the data we're finding, is this accurately representing what we think is happening? Or is it telling us something different? Are we measuring what we think we're measuring? Are we measuring performance or are we measuring perceptions? The external validity, can the results be generalized to other grocery stores? So can we use these outcomes and then plop them to the other community store? Or because of the product offering, of the pay structure, does that make it different? Is the measurement relevant in a cultural context? So if we're taking this to another community, if we're taking this to another state, if we're taking this to another country, would these measurements then apply to all of those contexts? Is it reliable? Did we create a valid and reliable instrument to collect this information? Did we use an anonymous survey? Or did we ask someone specifically and ask them for their name and then ask them for their position and their phone number? An anonymous survey and asking someone for their information does present two different types of information, and it can then question the reliability of our study. So remember, we have to make sure that the key questions we develop around our evaluations and our observations are then answering the methods in which we are conducting our study. So if we're doing the observation, have we created key questions to then support the observation? Is the archival data going to answer any potential key questions that we have developed? Are the interviews going to then answer key questions that we developed? All data is not good data. So just like here as Mark Twain says, collecting data is much like collecting garbage. You must know in advance what you are going to do with the stuff before collecting it. So you have to know if you are what type of evaluation you are conducting. What is this information going to inform before you go out and then collect the information? Because you may spend time collecting something that is not essential to your evaluation, that is not essential to your study, that is not essential to your observation. So again, some of the general data sources are observations, archival data, or informal or formal interviews. So some of the things you may want to consider are the evaluation questions for your overall culminating project as well as your observation. What is it you are trying to figure out through this process? And then also, how are you going to collect your data? In the grocery store observation, are you just simply observing and taking mental notes? Are you taking in a clipboard? Are you taking in typing something up on your phone? During the evaluation, are you sending out a survey monkey? Are you conducting formal interviews? Are you conducting a formal survey? Are you conducting some type of are you researching and conducting some type of test to see how well your program is performing? So these are all things you need to consider as you are collecting data. So hopefully this was helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email at john.wedding@csus.edu. Good luck, happy evaluation, happy observation.